When Melty Blood Type Lumina first launched in 2021, to say it had problems would be underselling the issues the game had just a little bit. Launch Lumina kinda sucked. The netcode wasn't all that great, the auto combo was intrusive, the game had no drip.
Sounds like you might be racist.
And something about a bathroom joke.
Don't say that shit. It's not funny.
But the reigning complaint about the game from players of all skill levels was centered around one mechanic. Shield. This little white glowing circle that every character had access to was regarded as the devil, and the complaints were justified. During the launch period of the game and for a long time afterwards, Shield was incredibly overbearing for many reasons, and is without a doubt cited as the biggest reason why people ended up turning away from the game to this day. But that was over 4 years ago. Things have changed a lot. When the game was more consistently receiving patches, Shield was the system mechanic that was targeted in balance changes the most. It slowly but surely ended up getting all of its wings clipped, and now, in the current version of the game, it's actually kind of whatever. How exactly this happened is what we'll be discussing today. We'll be going over the history of Shield and Type Lumina and all the major changes made along the way. But before we get to the good, we have to start with the bad. Starting with the game's launch in... This is Shield in its purest form, undiluted by balance patches and nerfs. The mechanic is unbothered by anything that comes its way. It's in its element, thriving, and some would say, broken. Also, Clash is blue for whatever reason. It's always weird coming back to 1.0 because it's not even just that Shield was broken, the whole game was kinda bad in comparison to today. Characters barely had any variety in their combos due to the combo scaling math on all moves being more strict. There are these weird pop-ups that don't mean anything to most people, and even an element of the game as fundamental as movement feels infinitely worse, due to characters being universally slower, and all movement options being chained down by extra frames of startup and recovery. Look how long it takes to act out of an empty air dash. Gross, but that's all besides the point. Shield is already a name mechanic in French Bread's other ventures, the old Melty Blood games and Under Night, but as you would expect, this take on Shield is far different than either of those games. The framework of Shield presented in version 1.0 is pretty simple and is nearly the same as it is today. When you have control of your character, i.e. when you're not in hit stun or block stun, you can press the D button and your shield will come out. If a strike or a projectile hits the shield, the defender has the ability to perform one of 3 different button follow-ups known as shield counters. Shield A counter is an immediate, highly prorated launcher follow-up, similar to the universal 3C. B counter is a delayed teleport vanish that hits from behind. And BC counter is a fast diagonal lunge that requires 50% of your moon gauge to even execute. Or, you can always do nothing. That's always an option. On the other side, the offender side, assuming they're not using a move that explicitly cannot interact with shield, like a moon skill or invincible reversal, they have a few options themselves. They have the option of shielding back, also called reshielding, to counter immediate follow-ups. They can not reshield and either continue pressing buttons to catch a shield drop into pressing, or to throw a held shield. They can react to a shield B counter with a delayed shield, or they can even do their own version of the costly shield BC counter in an attempt to avoid interacting with the shield system entirely. This can go back and forth until someone eventually gets hit or resets to neutral, and without going into the weeds about things like delay counters and all the different micro interactions, this dynamic between the offender and defender forms the basis of Type Lumina's Shield RPS. It's not a catch-all defensive system though. It primarily loses to throws and to attacks from behind that aren't protected by Type Lumina's cross-up protection. And if you compare it to something like Street Fighter 6's parry, which outside of perfect parry is completely agnostic as to whether it's performed standing or crouching, there are 2 different types of shield that you have to consider when using it on defense: standing high shield and crouching low shield. Using the 2 shields works about how you would expect. High shield would be able to shield high attacks and mid attacks, and low shield, inversely, would be able to shield low attacks and mid attacks. What? Yeah, this was the main issue with shield for the longest time. Low shield just kinda beat everything. Type Lumina has an offense structure built on strike throw stagger pressure. You throw the opponent to make them press, you catch their mashes with staggers, delay cancels, and frame traps to make them block. Then you can use things like the universal reverse beat to steal your turn back under the threat of countering the opponent's escape attempts. The very foundation of the game, with its large stagger windows, high damage combos, and frame data that pushes you towards reverse beats and special cancels, wants you to strike far more than you throw, unless you have a combo throw. It wants you to suffocate your opponent with fast, ambiguous resets and frame traps that make them crumble and commit to mashing something, anything under pressure. Frame traps that, when grounded, are almost entirely lows and mids. Low shield is not only broken, it countering both lows and mids fundamentally warped how Melty Blood's offense functioned. Sure, the attacker could beat a low shield attempt by throwing or going for an overhead, but those are incredibly high commitments when compared to low shield. The attacker has to meticulously structure their offense around low shield, and the best players absolutely did, but they still end up having to take a lot more risks in order to beat it out, and that's just to win one interaction. On the other side, at any point during the opponent's offense, the defender can press low shield in any gap, on wake up, or against any pressure reset attempt to try and force and then win the RPS. The defender side simply has way more opportunities to gamble on low shield, and the reward for winning the shield RPS was usually going to be a full combo for full damage. So being able to leverage these plentiful lower risk opportunities against not only low attacks, but against all mids as well, really skewed the risk reward associated with everything. It sucked, and people complained about it a lot, rightfully so, but major change wouldn't come until much later down the line. 1 year down the line. In the meantime, at least one patch would come out that would change shield up, even if just a bit. The version 1.21 patch of Type Lumina would come with a lot of baggage, with the main content delivered being the characters Mario Gallo Bastino and Powered CL. But the shield changes that released with the patch would also be pretty significant, for which there were two. Hi, me here, interrupting the flow of my own video. I misattributed the extended time stop on a shield trigger to the previous update, the one from January 2022, but it was part of this patch, that's my bad. It's a pretty neutral change, making shield more reactable for both parties, but it's not worth that much extra discussion. Back to the normal video. The first was the ability to reshield non-invincible EX moves. Prior to this update, if your opponent shielded your EX move, you weren't able to shield back and interact with the shield RPS, which guaranteed some sort of shield counterpunish, or at the minimum, a positional advantage against most EX moves. Now, you can. This change definitely added a lot of volatility to the game, and primarily strengthened zoners, since now no matter where they were on the screen, they could now use an EX special cancel to attempt to interact with the opponent going around their projectile, instead of eating a full punish. Though if they miss that, they just die. The second change is the addition of something called whiff penalty. This one requires a tiny bit of extra context. Let me show you something real quick. This is the anti-heat option select. If you play the game, you likely already know what this is. It's an intermediate technique that involves pressing an A normal and then pressing both an attack button and the shield button at the same time. If your opponent is blocking or mashing on wake up, you'll be able to hit them meaty and get your pressure or combo going. And if they try to do a wake up heat, you'll catch it with a shield. This option select works because you can cancel your universal A normals into any other move. This includes normals, specials, and yes, shield, which has priority on whiff. This was pretty powerful and invalidated heat pretty hard. If timed with a perfect meaty or used against a character without an invincible reversal, it only outright loses to backdash, another very powerful defensive option that has its own separate option select. So rotating the anti-backdash OS and anti-heat OS when applicable was a very valid strategy. The only thing that was always able to actively contest it was, funnily enough, low shield, which required a throw or overhead to beat, and did work to slow down the pace of offense since low shield was still broken at this point. But even then, that still led to the normal RPS scenario, and more importantly, the OS still worked as intended. Whiff penalty was added specifically to make the anti-heat option select worse. What whiff penalty does is make it so a shield that's cancelled from a whiffed A normal can only function like you tap the D button, a tap shield, and would disappear pretty shortly after activating if it doesn't catch anything. On its own, this change wouldn't mean much since the option select still catches wake up heat. But the same update also added blowback edge forced release, more simply referred to as charged heat. By holding down the A, B, and C buttons as opposed to just pressing it, you let out a much slower version of the heat activation burst, more than doubling the regular version's 13 frame startup to 28 frames. It's decently reactable, and the same can be applied to the guard cancel version of heat. Most high-level players can at least semi-consistently react to it with properly structured pressure. What makes it significant here is that it's active after whiff cancel shield enters its newly extended recovery period. In simple terms, charged heat punishes anti-heat OS. This added a unique layer to the wake-up dynamic that gave the defender more leeway. Now the decision became whether the attacker commits to an option select to catch heat or backdash with their respective OSs and risk whiffing the OS into eating a charged heat, or try and layer a meaty or even do nothing in a non-committal way that can catch charged heat on reaction, but, in turn, gives the defender the ability to do actions that may get caught by meaty OSs, like normal heat. This is, of course, an incredibly simple version of the dynamic that ignores the rest of the game's system mechanics, and guard cancel heat isn't exactly the strongest defensive option, but the point still stands. But while whiff penalty nerfs shield in the context of the anti-heat OS and certain neutral interactions, the problems with the core mechanic remain the same, and it would take another 4 months before anything would happen to the mechanic again. But when it did happen, longtime Lumina players will tell you how relieved they felt when the patch notes dropped and there was a laundry list of changes in those notes entirely about shield. All of these changes were good, and fundamentally changed how shield was used and countered for the better. The most obvious change was this. Standing mids no longer triggered low shield. It only took 11 months after the game's release, but it happened. As you saw, hitting a low shield with a 5B or 5C causes shield to enter a failed state that forces the defender into a block, while also chipping off a small amount of moon gauge and health. Though this change is slightly conditional, as the failed shield state from low shield only triggers on 5B and 5C. Mid-hitting command normals like Miyako's new 6B and Roa's 6C still trigger low shield. Failed shields were also added when using a crouching mid against high shield, but the amount of characters that have a crouching mid normal that can force that interaction is pretty small. Now if a player wants to trigger a shield against any sort of standing mid, like a stagger or a reverse beat, which are pretty common offensive options, they'd have to stand up and shield to make it happen, which opens them up to all low attacks, making shielding against common pressure a much bigger and riskier commitment than before. Combined with charged standing mids like CL, Vlav, and Dedapulse and Noel's charge 5C, now fatal countering low shield into full big damage combos, the attacking player now had more control over their offense by being given the ability to present an active risk to and disincentivize low shield at any point in their block string. The risk associated with failing your shield and the general risk that came with mashing shield was further amplified by the second biggest change of the patch, being that shield now actively interacted with the moon gauge. Prior to this update, the extent of which shield interacted with the moon system was significant, but very limited. If shield triggers, the defender gets 2 moon icons. If it whiffs or gets countered, they lose a moon icon. If either player does a shield BC counter, that would cost them 50% of their moon gauge. And depending on the amount of moon the player has when whiffing a shield, the amount of recovery frames would change. That was the extent of it. The state of holding shield was not influenced by anything aside from whiff penalty, which doesn't count as a moon gauge interaction. That changed radically in this patch. Shield now only gives 1 moon icon on a successful trigger, and continuously holding shield without interacting with anything would now drain moon as long as it's being held, completely dropping if there's no moon to drain. This made it so thoughtlessly holding shield forever was simply not possible anymore, and it outright penalized players for poor resource management by making it impossible to hold shield with no moon, which more often than not leads to an intentional or unintentional punish when whiffed in pressure, in part due to the extra recovery from a 0 moon shield whiff. This adjustment to the reward on a successful shield made it worse, and it indirectly served as a nerf to BC counter due to it now being more expensive. There were some smaller changes in the patch too. Shield now had a more visible drop animation, making it easier to react, but the main one from the notes was that A counter could now be jump cancelled on Clash, meaning you could do this against offensive BC counters in the corner. Pretty cool, right? To say that this patch saved the game to an extent would be apt, as they fixed some of the biggest complaints about the most overtuned mechanic in the game. But as the characters gained more oppressive tools and shield now existing in this very toned down state with a whole lot more risk for a very slightly lesser reward, top players would tell you that this would actually be the start of shield being kinda mid. But they weren't quite done nerfing it yet. In May of 2024, 1 year after the game's previous balance patch in May of 2023, another patch was released. Version 1.46, the current version of Type Lumina at the time of this video. This patch is definitely interesting. The change catalog was almost entirely buffs, with nearly every character receiving at least a little something cool, and the changes made to how moon skills interacted with moon gauge significantly changed how combo routes were structured across nearly the entire cast. However, while most changes in the patch are strictly buffs, there were a couple things that received actual nerfs, with the biggest nerf being the changes made to Roa, according to Roa players. And in second place was Shield. Shield got nerfed hard, and once again completely changed how the mechanic is evaluated in the present meta of the game, with 3 main changes noted in the aim of adjustment section of the patch notes. The first change was actually not that important and is purely visual. Shielding an attack that cannot be reshielded like a moon skill or an invincible reversal now produces golden sparks to indicate that property. It's a pretty neat addition, though I personally don't notice it sometimes. The second change was a bit more significant in that all 3 shield counters did significantly less damage than before. In every version prior to this one, shield's damage scaled like any other normal starter and output numbers that could be described as average, or even quite good depending on the character and the actual shield counter. With these changes, the damage that could be done off of a shield counter now ranged from below average to pretty damn terrible. This change generally lowers the risk associated with eating a shield counter as the attacker, which is what I assume is meant by, overall, the risk of shield cancellation is reduced for the shielded side, so that the offensive side is not suddenly matched simply because they are shielded. Though, of course, the main benefit of landing a shield counter or any hit, converting into a knockdown for Okizeme, still exists and is very good. And the last change? Just look at this. You notice that? Shield B is now unable to be reshielded. The aim of this specific change was to make the shield play easier to understand and more intuitive than before. And to their credit, it succeeded in that aspect, by guaranteeing a punish on a reshielded B counter and removing any successive branches that a reshielded B counter could have added to the shield RPS interactions. It makes the mechanic much easier to understand. This decision, as a design choice, on the other hand, is much harder to understand at a deeper level and is probably the strangest decision made to shield in the history of the game. Why, you may ask? Shield B was already very, very bad. While Shield A and Shield B C counters guarantee a combo on hit, Shield B only grants a combo on counter hit, which will usually only happen if the opponent immediately reshields and holds, or if they continue to press after the shield trigger. That must mean it has at least good advantage on hit, right? Landing a non-counter hit grounded Shield B counter gives you, at most, +1 frame advantage against crouching opponents and +0 against standing opponents, which in some matchups gives the opponent a better position in the post-Shield B scramble due to having better frame advantage at the spacing it puts you at. And in the air, depending on your height, you may actually be minus on hit, which is never fun. And of course, having Shield B block puts you at -2 against a grounded opponent, which is completely safe, but it's completely punishable if the opponent air blocks it at any height due to landing recovery, which is not an uncommon interaction at all. I'm sure you understand by this point. Shield B counter was already bad and carried a low reward for a high risk. Now it had an even larger risk associated with an even worse reward. To me, it definitely is one of the strangest changes to Shield, but in a way, it's emblematic of the complete shift in attitude towards Shield from a design perspective. Every change that Melty Blood Type Lumina Shield received has slowly transformed the mechanic into what it is today, a shell of its former self. You can call it balanced, you can call it underpowered and overcorrected, but no matter what, it's subjectively much weaker. Now, don't get me wrong, it still has its place in the game and absolutely will be used, as it's the same mechanic at its core and everything in the game was built around Shield, but that's kind of why it's seen as mid and even bad now depending on who you ask. Characters continue to grow stronger every patch, players continue to get better, but the defensive mechanics that the offense and players had to work around only grew weaker. With the reward on Shield from moon gain to damage only getting worse as it continuously mounted more risk, with so many tools breaking it wide open, it's no wonder that it no longer strikes despair into the hearts of players like it once used to. For better, or maybe for worse, the all-consuming beast that Type Lumina Shield once was, is now only but a relic of the past. Thanks for watching.